Hi everyone, my name is Britta Johnson, and I'll be discussing a very important wild animal welfare issue, and that is the wildlife welfare implications of animal agriculture-driven habitat destruction. Specifically, I'll cover land animals in order to really narrow in and do this critical subject justice. Now, animal agriculture impacts wild animals in a myriad of different ways, but habitat destruction is the biggest welfare concern according to the literature, so we'll be looking solely at that issue today. Here's a quick overview of what I'll cover on the subject. I'll start with the scope of the impacts of habitat loss on wild animal welfare and why it matters, then discuss how factory farming contributes to this issue, and go more into detail about some of the biggest welfare problems experienced by wild animals as a result of habitat destruction. First, I'm going to briefly outline the scope of the issue before diving into the details. We know that animal agriculture has welfare implications for billions of farmed land animals. However, the current single biggest threat to wild animals is actually habitat loss, and most of that is driven by animal agriculture. So animal agriculture has not only direct welfare implications for the farmed animals, but indirect welfare implications for wild animals. So from an animal welfare perspective, this is quite an important topic just when you look at sheer numbers of animals alone. Here's a few facts and figures to illustrate the magnitude further. So habitat loss and fragmentation is the current biggest threat to wild animals. In a very recent piece of research from 2022, actually, the authors found that 88% of the 20,000 different vertebrate species studied would lose at least some of their habitat to agricultural expansion by 2050. And they found that there are around 28,000 species currently at risk of becoming extinct, and agriculture is the primary threat to 24,000, which is 86%. Continuing on here, agriculture is responsible for 80% of the changes in land use that we see globally. And change in land use is the process where a specific land has one purpose and then the land is converted to be used for a different purpose. So in this case, we're talking about changing lands like forests or other wildlife habitat into agricultural land. And a few specifics about forests because they're very important. In the US, there are only 6% of virgin forests remaining. And globally, a third of the world's forests have been lost since the last ice age. And the reason forests are a very important part of this conversation is because they're home to many animals, and so that's why I'm mentioning them here. So to put it in perspective for you, forests are home to 80% of amphibian species, 75% of bird species, and 68% of mammalian species. All right, now that I've given you a bit of a macro context, a sort of big picture for why habitat loss is a relevant and important issue for wild animal welfare, and that agriculture is the main contributor to the destruction of wildlife habitat, I'm going to explain a bit about the how animal agriculture plays a role. So there's the issue of direct habitat destruction, where habitats like forests, like grasslands, are cleared for both the farms themselves as well as for livestock feed production. And that would include clearing land for things like crops, fertilizer, and pesticides. And the methods can be burning, using machinery, or other methods in order to actually clear the lands away. To give you a sense of the amount of crops that are used to feed animals, when we look at clearing land for soy production, for example, around 75% of the soy that's produced is used to feed livestock. So that's a significant amount. Then we have animals losing their habitats as a result of animal agriculture indirectly through climate change. So I'm going to talk you through the role of animal agriculture in climate change and how that drives habitat loss. So we'll start with greenhouse gas emissions. So greenhouse gas emissions are a major driver of climate change, and currently animal-based foods are responsible for around 20% of anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. Anthropogenic meaning that it's caused by humans. So if the status quo of animal agriculture continues to increase with more demand for animal products, a bigger world population, more wealth, etc., we would expect that 20% number to increase as well. So in short, animal agriculture is a significant contributor to the warming of the earth. And now the temperature of the earth, as it's warming, it's gone up 0.07 degrees Celsius every 10 years since 1880. and we've actually seen the 5 warmest years ever recorded during the years between 2015 to now. So things are definitely heating up. And when the climate changes like this, we see more adverse weather conditions and natural disasters that destroy animal habitats. In a study conducted by Clark et al., which was in 2019, looking at the impact of different foods on the environment, they found that a serving of processed red meat and a serving of unprocessed red meat, so cows, had the first and second highest environmental impacts based on these 5 environmental factors that they measured. 2 of them were greenhouse gas emissions and land use, so when they compared them to vegetables. And then chicken, fish, and dairy had the next highest environmental impact. So while this may be a less direct impact on habitat loss than going in and clearing a forest directly for livestock or for livestock feed, it still very much contributes to habitat loss for wild animals. And so that's why it's really important that it's part of this conversation. I included this chart here, which is a nice simple overview of land use. Now you can see clearly that of the 71% of habitable land, this dark green at the top, 49%, so about half, is made up of agriculture, and 78% of that is for farmed animal agriculture. So compared with the plant agriculture over here, it is quite land intensive. And I think this chart does a really nice job visualizing why animal agriculture is such a big driver of habitat loss from a land use perspective. Okay, so now that I've spoken about the actual methods and ways industrial animal agriculture contributes to wildlife habitat loss, I'm going to bring it all together by discussing how that habitat loss directly impacts the welfare of individual wild animals. So now we're really zooming all the way in. First, I'm going to talk about resource-related welfare concerns, and then I will talk about short and long-term health and well-being welfare concerns. And just a quick note, this photo here is actually of a kangaroo and her Joey, who survived the wildfires in Australia. If you remember, if you had watched the news back in 2019 and 2020, it ultimately impacted around 3 billion vertebrate animals, according to a report by the World Wildlife Fund. And of course, even more invertebrates. They were just not part of the analysis, but of course we know a lot more of them are also impacted. First, let's discuss resource-related welfare concerns. So being a wild animal is already tough when it comes to resources, and we know this. Then when a habitat is lost, along with it are the plants which grow native in that environment and any species who lose their lives, both of which normally help sustain those ecosystems. And as a result, habitat loss makes it more difficult for wild animals to find food. An example here is from the Woolsey Fire in Los Angeles in 2018, and this comes to mind because I was living there at the time actually, and the welfare of the mountain lion population was severely impacted. Many of them actually survived the fires, which burned almost 100,000 acres, but some sadly died of starvation due to a lack of vegetation to sort of hide in while they hunt, and also less prey. Additionally, in the case that animals are forced out of their habitat completely by a process that Fisher refers to in Andrew's book as forced migration, they're then up against increased competition with other animals for what become limited resources in the new habitat. And another welfare issue related to lack of resources is loss of areas to nest, which is another big one. Here's actually a picture of a mountain lion. We're going to loop back to the mountain lions in a minute on this slide. So now to health and well-being welfare concerns. When habitats are destroyed, there are both welfare concerns that result from the immediate effects of the habitat loss, and then some long-term impacts as well related to animals who survive, having to migrate into new habitats or live in whatever's remaining of their habitat. So I'm going to start with the immediate impacts. Now we know that a common welfare issue for wild animals is sustaining injuries, and that's again just part of living out in the wild. However, the injuries experienced by wild animals can be exacerbated by land clearing for animal agriculture and disruption to their habitat due to climate change. The most common immediate injuries that can be suffered by tree-dwelling animals directly from habitat clearing include crushing, fall-related injuries, eye and head injuries, bleeding, broken bones, and being entrapped and sometimes eventually crushed, especially for those animals who live sort of in the tree hollows. And then for ground animals, crushing, unfortunately, is the most common injury because of trees and such falling on them. And so sadly, wild animals don't have a vet to come help them when they're injured in this way. So unless there's a situation like a natural disaster where rescue teams go in after looking for animals, which sometimes happened, it did happen in Australia, many of them will ultimately die or experience pain. And then there are immediate welfare concerns related to wild animal relationships. So this includes being separated from conspecifics and family members, or on the other side, being forced into adverse confrontations with individuals or groups that these animals typically avoid, which can lead to conflicts that cause injury or death. So now I'm going to loop back to these mountain lions. Researchers saw that there were injuries and deaths caused not by the fire itself, but by being forced to find new habitats, and in that way being struck and killed by cars attempting to cross freeways, or getting injured by other mountain lions when they crossed into their territory. Just a couple examples of what they saw. Now I will go into some of the long-term impacts, welfare impacts. So some new habitats may be unnatural for a particular species and possibly in areas that are close to humans. And in these cases, animals can end up with new labels by humans, if you will, from being just a wild animal to now being labeled as a pest, for example. And that has definite welfare implications. So an example, if you see this picture of this nice black bear here, I'm going to give an example from New Jersey in the US, which is not far from Connecticut, where I'm from. Black bears have been losing their habitats and encroaching on human neighborhoods, in some cases killing family pets left in the yard or causing disturbances, showing up in people's garages unannounced and uninvited, rummaging through their trash, and just doing other bear things, knocking down bird feeders and just causing a ruckus. And as a result, there have been culling tactics like bear hunts organized with minimum goals of how many bears the local government wants killed in order to sort of get rid of some of these bears. And so this is a pretty clear example of a wild animal then becoming labeled as a pest because of their forced proximity to humans and then having to live with the welfare consequences of that. All right, moving on from the bears. So the health of wild animals is already a welfare issue for them, as I mentioned, due to lack of veterinary care, and their health can be further impacted by the effects of animal farming I've described. Specifically, natural disasters and extreme weather conditions can make survival more difficult in the long run, since they evolutionarily are not equipped to handle the real havoc that land clearing and climate change can have on their habitats. So in the ideal scenario, an animal can regulate themselves when they experience environmental stressors like these, but with these really intense disruptions to their lives, like fully losing their habitat, they may fail to adapt and instead live in a constant state of stress, which can impact their immune function, reproduction, among other things. And some of the direct causes of reduced fertility and reproductive output include low body condition due to lack of food, a lack of mates with whom to reproduce, and also the lack of areas to nest that I mentioned previously in the resource-related welfare concerns. So to wrap up this discussion, I just want to briefly share what some of the literature says on the subject of what we can actually do to help with this issue of wild animal welfare concerns brought about by the practice of habitat destruction by the animal agriculture industry. So the authors of the 2022 study of deforestation and animal welfare that I mentioned earlier include eating more plant-based foods as one way of decreasing the demand for agricultural land for animals. Another study found that predicted future habitat losses can be reduced by a pretty significant amount, 40 to 60%, if at a policy level, some strict climate change measures are put into place. And of course, this would include changes to animal agriculture, since they are a larger contributor to climate change, as mentioned. And lastly, something very important that Finn and Stevens noted in their research is that there currently isn't a real protocol that measures how individual animal welfare is impacted by very routine human actions like habitat clearing. But with the information that we do have and that I've addressed here relating to the numbers of animals impacted through death, pain, disease, lack of resources, and the psychological distress, they believe there is sufficient reason to make this type of research a priority, and I would agree with them. I have some references here for you. Please feel free to pause if you are interested in looking at any of these further. Here's my contact information, so please email me if you have any questions or you just want to talk more about the subject. Thank you so much for watching.